let's dive in. Today we're tackling something you probably don't think about too much. Dust.
Uh-oh. Not housework tips already.
No, not that kind of dust.
Right.
We're going deep into the dangerous stuff, the kind you find in industrial settings. You know, the kind that can actually be a health hazard. We've got a whole pile of research and guidelines and even some real-world advice from industry pros.
Sounds like we're about to uncover some dirty secrets.
Exactly. You might never look at a speck of dust the same way again.
I'm intrigued already.
So one of the things that really jumped out at me was this whole PM 2.5 thing.
PM 2.5.
Yeah, you know, these microscopic dust particles, so small they can actually sneak right into your bloodstream.
Seriously.
Seriously. I mean, think about it. Every breath you take, you could be inhaling these tiny particles.
And they're so small, they can bypass all our body's usual defenses. It's not like a sneeze where you just expel something large.
Right, and that's what makes them so dangerous. I mean, a little cough here and there, that's one thing, but...
It's not just about a cough. The research is pretty clear. Exposure to PM 2.5 is linked to all sorts of health problems. Respiratory issues, obviously, like asthma and bronchitis. But we're also talking heart disease, even some cancers. Pretty scary stuff.
It's not just dust bunnies under the bed anymore.
Nope, dust isn't just dust. It's often a whole cocktail of chemicals, depending on where it comes from. We're talking heavy metals, things like lead and cadmium, asbestos, silica.
Wow. So how do we tell the harmless dust from the hazardous dust? What makes one type worse than another?
Well, there are a few key things to look at. First, there's the chemical composition itself. Some materials, like lead or asbestos, are just inherently toxic, no matter what. Then there's the size of those particles. We already touched on that a bit. The smaller the particle, the deeper it can travel into your lungs. Gets lodged in there. And finally, there's this concept called solubility. It's a bit technical, but basically it's how easily a substance dissolves in liquid.
So like sugar in water?
Exactly. Some dust particles, once they're in your lungs, can dissolve into your bloodstream really quickly.
Okay, starting to get the picture. So we've got this potentially dangerous dust floating around, getting into our bodies. How do we know how much is too much? Where's the line?
That's where things get a little alphabet soupy. We start talking about things like PLs, STELs, TWAs.
I'm already lost.
Haha, it's not as complicated as it sounds. Basically, these are all ways of setting limits on how much dust exposure is considered safe, like speed limits for breathing.
Speed limits for breathing. I like that.
Right. So, for example, a PL, or permissible exposure limit, that's like the highway speed limit. It tells you the maximum amount of a substance you should be exposed to over a typical 8-hour workday. Then there are STELs, short-term exposure limits. Those are for those bursts of exposure, like taking an exit ramp.
Okay, so different limits for different scenarios. But what about the air we breathe outside of work? Are there speed limits for that too?
You bet. That's where the EPA comes in. They set what are called NAAQS, National Ambient Air Quality Standards. These are limits for things like PM 2.5 in the air we all breathe, whether we're at work or just walking down the street.
So we've got all these limits, different rules of the road depending on where you are. Makes sense. But how do you even measure dust in the first place? It's so tiny.
Well, you might be surprised. There's a whole range of techniques, from the really old school methods.
Like what? Literally sweeping it up and weighing it.
Pretty much. That's the gravimetric method. But we've also got much more high-tech options these days. We're talking lasers, electron microscopes.
Lasers? Now that's cool.
I know, right? The lasers are used in optical particle counters. They basically shine a light through the air, and the way the light scatters tells you about the size and concentration of the dust particles.
That's like a dust spotlight.
Exactly. And then with electron microscopes, we can actually see individual dust particles in crazy detail. We can see their shape, their size, even their chemical makeup.
So we can actually identify what a dust particle is made of. That's amazing.
It is. And this accurate measurement, it's crucial for keeping workers safe and for protecting the environment too.
Right, because what happens in the workplace doesn't necessarily stay in the workplace.
Exactly. Air pollution is everyone's problem.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the big question. What do we do about all this dust? How do we actually control it?
Yeah, I'm ready to move on to solutions. What have you got for us?
Well, the good news is there's a whole arsenal of strategies out there. It's like building a dust-busting toolkit. And our first weapon is something called source control.
Source control.
Yeah, the idea is to stop the dust before it even starts.
Prevention is the best medicine, as they say.
Exactly. So that can involve things like using different materials that generate less dust, changing work processes, or even implementing dust suppression systems.
So we're being proactive, not reactive.
Right. But of course, we can't always prevent dust completely. So once it's in the air, we need a way to get it out. That's where ventilation comes in.
Ventilation.
Yeah, basically think of it as a giant lung for the building. Removing contaminated air, bringing in fresh, clean air.
Right, get that bad air out of there. But what about those tiny particles, the ones that can really get deep into our lungs?
That's where filters come in, especially HEPA filters.
I've heard of those.
They're like a really fine mesh that traps those tiny particles.
So they're not just for air purifiers?
Nope, they're used in all sorts of industrial settings. But just like any tool, they need to be maintained. A clogged filter isn't going to do much good.
Makes sense. It's like changing the oil in your car. You got to keep those filters clean. But I imagine it's not just about the technology, right?
You're absolutely right. Even with the best ventilation and filtration systems, you need to train your workers.
So it's a people problem, too.
Absolutely. People need to understand the risks. They need to know how to use personal protective equipment like respirators. They need to be able to spot potential dust hazards.
So empowering workers to protect themselves and their colleagues, it's a team effort.
Exactly. And it's an ongoing process. You can't just set it and forget it. Regular monitoring and testing are key to making sure those dust control measures are actually working.
It's a constant battle against dust. So we've got source control, ventilation, filtration, worker training, and ongoing monitoring. What other dust-busting secrets are hidden in these sources?
Well, one that often gets overlooked is good old-fashioned housekeeping.
Housekeeping. You mean cleaning?
Yep. Keeping work areas clean, free of dust buildup. It can make a big difference.
So basic, yet so important.
It's not just about appearances. It's about safety. A clean workplace is a safer workplace. And there's one more piece to this puzzle. We've been talking a lot about health. But all this dust control, it's not just good for workers. It's good for business, too.
Right. That's what I wanted to get to. The research actually shows some real financial benefits.
Exactly. Fewer workplace illnesses mean lower healthcare costs, less absenteeism. That translates to higher productivity, a healthier bottom line.
It's a win-win for everyone. And there's the whole legal side of things too, right?
Absolutely. Failing to meet those OSHA standards for dust exposure can lead to some hefty fines. Investing in dust control, it's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do.
So ethics and economics go hand in hand.
Well said. And let's not forget the less tangible benefits. Improved employee morale, a better company image.
Right. A company that cares about its workers' health is a company people want to work for. And customers like doing business with companies they can trust.
Exactly. It all comes down to creating a culture of safety and well-being. But before we get too far ahead of ourselves,
let's pause here and let our listeners digest everything we've covered so far. It's a lot to take in.
Definitely. We've uncovered some of the hidden dangers lurking in those tiny dust particles, explored the incredible ways we can measure them, and talked about the practical steps businesses can take to keep those dust levels in check.
But before we move on to part 2, I want to hear from you, dear listener. What's stood out to you so far? What's made you think differently about dust? Take a moment to reflect on that, and we'll be right back.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the dust.
It's amazing how much there is to know about something we so often just, sweep under the rug, literally.
Right. It really highlights how even the smallest things can have a big impact.
One thing that really fascinated me was all this dust measurement stuff. It's not just about weighing it on a scale anymore, is it?
Oh, definitely not. Technology has really revolutionized the way we monitor and analyze dust, especially those superfine particles, the PM 2.5.
Yeah, the sources mention lasers, electron microscopes. It's like something straight out of a sci-fi movie.
I know, right? So one of the most common techniques nowadays is optical particle counting.
Okay, how does that work?
They use a laser beam to basically illuminate the air, and when those dust particles pass through the beam, they scatter the light.
So the laser's like a spotlight, revealing those tiny particles.
Exactly. And by analyzing the way the light scatters, we can figure out the size and concentration of the dust.
That's pretty ingenious.
It's a really accurate and efficient way to measure PM 2.5.
What about those electron microscopes? Those sound even more high-tech.
Oh, they are. Electron microscopy lets us see dust particles at incredibly high magnification. Like we can see their shape, their size, even their chemical composition.
Wait, so you can actually see what a dust particle is made of?
Pretty much. It's amazing, right?
That blows my mind.
This technique is especially useful when we're dealing with those potentially toxic dusts, like asbestos fibers.
So it's like dust fingerprint analysis.
You got it. We can identify exactly what type of dust it is and understand how dangerous it might be. And that accurate measurement It's not just about protecting workers, it's about protecting the environment too.
Right, because what happens inside a factory or plant doesn't always stay there.
Exactly. Air pollution is everyone's problem. But now that we're starting to understand the dangers, let's talk solutions. The sources we've got here, they offer some really practical advice for businesses looking to control dust.
Yeah, I was really impressed by the range of strategies they outline. It's not a one-size-fits-all situation, is it?
Not at all. The best approach really depends on the industry, the type of dust, the layout of the facility.
Are there any general principles, though, that kind of apply across the board?
Absolutely. One of the most fundamental principles is something called source control. Basically, it's about minimizing the amount of dust you're producing in the first place.
So stop the dust before it even starts.
You got it. So that could mean using different materials, tweaking the way you do things, or even implementing dust suppression systems. It's all about taking proactive steps.
Okay, I can see how that would make a big difference. But what about the dust that's already in the air? What do we do about that?
Well, that's where ventilation and filtration come in. A good ventilation system is going to remove the contaminated air from the work area and replace it with clean, fresh air.
So it's like giving the building its own respiratory system.
A great analogy.
Yeah.
And then we have filters, especially HEPA filters, which trap those tiny, harmful particles.
We talked about those HEPA filters before, right?
Yep. And they're really important. They prevent those particles from circulating back into the workplace. But it's crucial to remember, they need regular maintenance. A clogged filter isn't going to help anyone.
Right, just like changing the air filter in your car.
Yeah.
Got to keep things clean. But I have a feeling it's not all about the technology, is it?
You're absolutely right. Even with all the fancy tech in the world, you need to train your workers.
So the human element is crucial.
Absolutely. Employees need to understand the risks. They need to know how to use their personal protective equipment, things like respirators, and they need to be able to identify those potential dust hazards before they become a problem.
It's about giving people the knowledge and the tools to stay safe.
Exactly. And it's an ongoing process. It's not a one-and-done thing. You need to constantly monitor and test, make sure all those dust control measures are actually working.
It's a never-ending battle against dust. So we've covered source control, ventilation, filtration, worker training, ongoing monitoring. What other tricks do we have up our sleeve?
One thing that often gets overlooked, and it's actually one of the simplest, good housekeeping.
You mean cleaning?
Exactly. Just keeping things clean, free of dust buildup can make a big difference.
So basic, but essential.
It's not just about appearances, it's about safety. A clean workplace is a safer workplace. And there's another piece to all of this that we haven't really talked about yet. I've been focusing on the health aspects, but all this dust control, it's good for business too.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, the research actually highlights some real financial benefits.
Exactly. Fewer sick employees mean lower healthcare costs and less absenteeism. And that means higher productivity and a better bottom line.
It's a win-win for everyone.
And then there's the whole legal side of things. If companies don't meet OSHA standards for dust exposure, they can face some pretty hefty fines.
So investing in dust control is not just the right thing to do ethically, it's the smart move financially.
Absolutely. And then there are the less obvious benefits, like employee morale gets a boost, the company's image improves.
It's true. People want to work for a company that cares about their safety, and customers like to support businesses that are doing the right thing.
Exactly. It all comes down to creating this culture of safety and well-being. But before we move on,
let's give our listeners a moment to catch their breath. We've covered a lot of ground here.
We have. We've delved into the hidden dangers of dust, explored the amazing technologies we use to measure it, and discussed practical steps that businesses can take to control it.
So much to think about. But before we jump into part 3, I want to hear from you, the listener. What has resonated with you the most? What new insights have you gained about dust? Take a moment to reflect on that, and we'll be right back. And we're back for the final leg of our dust exploration.
Hope you've all had a chance to clear the air, so to speak.
You know, going through all this research, I gotta say, I got a little tripped up by all those acronyms. PLLs, STELs, TWAs, it's a lot to keep straight.
Yeah, it's like learning a whole new language.
Right. And I bet our listeners feel the same way. Maybe we could break down a few more of those terms.
Absolutely. Let's start with TLV, which stands for Threshold Limit Value.
TLV, okay. Is that similar to those PLs we talked about earlier?
It is. The idea is similar, but there's a key difference. TLVs, their recommendations, they're developed by a group called the ACGIH, whereas PLLs are actual legal standards set by OSHA.
So TLVs are like best practices and PLs are the law.
You got it. TLVs are often a more cautious approach, setting limits that are even lower than those legally required PLLs.
So companies might choose to follow those TLVs even if they're not legally required to.
Exactly. Many companies go above and beyond the bare minimum, to really ensure they're doing everything they can to keep their workers safe. It shows a real commitment.
Makes sense. So it's like choosing to drive below the speed limit just to be extra safe.
Perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And then there's another term you might come across, REL.
REL, okay, what's that stand for?
Recommended exposure limit. These are recommendations developed by NIS, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. Similar to TLVs, these are about providing guidance on safe exposure levels.
So many acronyms, so many organizations.
It's a lot, I know. But it's important to understand who's who in the zoo, so to speak. OSHA sets those legal standards. ACGIH and NIOH, they're more about research and recommendations.
Got it. So it's all a team effort to protect workers.
Exactly. And as we learn more about the effects of dust, these guidelines, they'll continue to evolve.
It's a constantly changing field, so it's important to stay informed.
Absolutely. Now let's talk about something we haven't really touched on yet. The psychological effects of dust.
The psychological effects. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, we talk a lot about the physical health impacts, but there's a growing awareness of how working in a dusty environment can mess with your head too.
Like how?
Well, imagine you're working in a place where you can actually see the dust in the air. It can create a feeling of unease, even fear, just seeing that constant reminder of a potential threat.
Yeah, it's like a visual representation of the danger.
Right. And even if you can't see the dust, just knowing that it's there can cause stress. You start worrying about the long-term health consequences. It can really affect morale.
So it's not just about the actual exposure, it's also about the perception of risk.
Exactly. That's why it's so important for companies to be transparent, to talk to their employees about the risks, the control measures, the monitoring results.
Open communication builds trust for sure.
And let's not forget about productivity. Workers who are stressed and worried about their health aren't going to be at their best.
So addressing those psychological impacts can actually benefit a company's bottom line.
Absolutely. It's about taking a holistic approach to workplace safety, looking at the big picture. Now, as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of dust, I want to leave our listeners with a question to ponder.
Hit us with it.
We've learned so much about dust, the dangers, the ways to mitigate those dangers. But it makes me wonder, what else can we do as individuals, as communities, to ensure we're all breathing clean air? Not just at work, but everywhere.
That's a great question. It's a reminder that the air we breathe, it's a shared resource, and protecting it is a responsibility we all share.
Exactly. So thinking bigger, looking beyond ourselves, considering the impact of our actions.
So, dear listener, as you go about your day, take a moment to really appreciate that next breath. Think about those tiny dust particles, the choices we make, and how we can create a healthier future for everyone.
Thanks for joining us on this journey into the world of dust.
We hope you've learned a thing or two and maybe even changed the way you look at those tiny specks floating in the air. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and keep breathing easy.